This is a 2008 Audi S6, and it looks like a fairly tame, docile luxury sedan. An understated, simple, get-yourself-to-work German luxury car, except it has a Lamborghini V10 under the hood. Today, I'm going to review the S6 and show you that and everything else. Before I get started, big news, this S6 is currently listed for sale on Cars and Bids, my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era. These V10 Lamborghini-powered S6s are hard to come by, but this one is being auctioned live right now on Cars and Bids. So, once you've finished watching this video, click the link in the description to head over to Cars and Bids and to this car's auction, and you can bid on it and buy this Audi S6, only on Cars and Bids at carsandbids.com. But anyway, let's talk S6. Now, back in the late 1990s, Audi bought Lamborghini, and the increase in quality was immediately evident in Lamborghini's products. But the synergy went both ways. For the 2007 model year, Audi debuted an S6 sedan with the V10 from the Lamborghini Gallardo, with a few tweaks to make it more sedan-friendly. Now, the S6 didn't have as much power as the Gallardo, but it did have 435 horsepower from a Lamborghini V10 in a mid-size Audi sedan. Unfortunately, the party didn't last long. These days, the Audi S6 has a 2.9-liter V6. It's turbocharged, it's a fun car, but it's a far cry from the Lamborghini V10-powered luxury sports sedan. So today, I'm going to review this one. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of this S6 and show you all the quirks and features of the greatest S6 Audi ever made. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug's score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the V10 S6 with the first thing you do when you get in the car, and that would be turn it on. But the engine start button is very strange. For one thing, it's boring. Just look, this is the engine start button. Most other brands with a starter button around this time had like a bright red button on the steering wheel or the dashboard. This thing looks like it could just turn on the defroster, frankly, but that's the engine start button. And of course, you can see right above engine start, you have engine stop, which turns off the engine and looks similarly boring. But that's not the weirdest thing about these buttons. The weirdest thing is you can turn on the car normally with the key. You get in, put the key in the little key slot, turn it on, and then you've started the engine. You can completely bypass the engine start, engine stop buttons. Or you can get in the car and not put in the key and press those buttons. You have options when you get in here of how you want to start the car. Very strange to see two different choices. And there are a lot of rather unusual controls in this car, really. For instance, to the right of the center screen, you have this rather large button with a line and then an arrow pointing to like a check mark. That opens the glove box. You push that, the glove box unlatches, and then it opens unbelievably slowly and luxuriously to like reveal what is inside the glove box. But that strange button is what does it. You don't have a traditional glove box latch in this S6. Next up, another weird control. To the left of the center screen, you have a button that says check. If you press check, then all of your warning lights will cycle through in this center screen in the gauge cluster. You can see they're all appearing, having a little party. What the car is doing now is checking all of your various systems to make sure everything is okay. But instead of just doing that in the background, it actually goes through each individual warning light in full color right in front of you, I guess, so you can see that it really is checking. And then at the end, if nothing is problematic, it just goes back to your typical center gauge cluster screen. Kind of a strange feature, but that's how it works. And next up, another interesting control in this car. On the steering wheel, on the right side, you have this little button with an arrow and a couple of like sound lines. That activates your voice control system. Yes, this 13-year-old car had voice control, and it works about as well as you might expect. Let me demonstrate it for you. Volume up.
Cancel.
And next up, another rather interesting control in this car. In the center control stack, you have a button marked valet. You press it, and you can see that it turns on, and then maybe the valet doesn't have access to like your glove box or your trunk or something. But the weird thing is, the valet can just press this button again to turn it off, and then valet mode is off. Now, maybe this button works in conjunction with a special valet key like in a lot of cars, but then I have to ask, why do you have the button if you have the key also? It's just kind of strange, and it's a little awkward. You know, you give the valet the car, he gets in, and then he sees you've put it in valet mode. You don't trust him. It's kind of strange to have that right there staring you in the face. And next up, another interesting control situation in this car is the climate control. As you can see, a rather complicated climate control setup in here. I counted, you have 17 buttons in here and 2 dials, but none of those things adjust your fan speed. You can see there's no fan speed adjuster. In order to change the fan speed, you must first press the fan button, and then your climate temperature dial becomes your fan dial temporarily, and you can move the dial and adjust the fan speed. Now, interestingly, when you're doing that, it is showing the fan speed on the climate controls themselves and also on the center screen, so you're seeing it in 2 different places. So there's no dial to adjust the fan speed in its default setting, but when you start adjusting it, it shows you in 2 spots, 6 inches apart, exactly what your fan speed is. Kind of an interesting solution, but that was Audi in the late 2000s. And speaking of that center screen, that was one of Audi's earliest efforts at like a center infotainment screen. And by modern standards, it's pretty complicated, pretty small, and not very functional, but it is interesting to check out. Now, they called it MMI for multimedia interface, and I think they still call their infotainment that, although it's evolved quite a bit from this. In order to control MMI, you had 15 buttons here in the center console, plus this 1 dial in the center that was sort of the controller that allowed you to scroll through things. And you could press these various different buttons to get to various different menus and places on the screen. Now, there's not that much unusual stuff in here, although in older Audi models, I always love adjusting the frequency of the parking sensors because you can play a little song. Here is my song. But if you wanted to adjust something that was actually practical, it was a little bit difficult because you didn't have a touch screen and this button interface was kind of complicated. For instance, setting a navigation destination, you have to go letter by letter, scrolling through the alphabet to each individual letter. It would have taken forever to do, but this was old school navigation systems, and frankly, this was better than some, but still very cumbersome, and of course, no one would use it today. But anyway, next up, moving away from the screen, some more interesting quirks in here. For one thing, the visor mirror situation. You drop the visor, you have a mirror, but you actually have 2 mirrors. Here's your first one, normal visor mirror, but you can slide it over and then you have like a magnified mirror, so you can look at yourself a little bit more magnified, and you have this over on both sides, 2 different levels of zoom for your visor mirror. That is a nice touch. Next up, another nice touch, a little quirk in here. You can see the cup holders here in the center console. You open up this lid and there's the cup holder, except there's this little square off to the side. So why is that? That would be for a coffee mug. If you have a coffee mug with like a mug handle coming off to the side, you can put the handle in there and then you'll have exactly enough room. So this isn't just a cup holder, it's also a mug holder. And if you lift up this center armrest, which is also a little center storage area, you can see a second cup holder with the same basic idea. A circle with a little cutout on the side so you can put a mug there. Apparently, Audi had gotten customer feedback that their cup holders weren't mug friendly, so they changed that for the S6. And next up, another interesting feature in here, this car has adaptive cruise control. 2008 Audi S6 adaptive cruise control. The way it worked was kind of interesting. You turn on the cruise control with this little stalk coming off the steering column, and then the speed that you were setting it to would light up on the outside of your speedometer in these previously unseen red lights. And you can set it, obviously, to whatever speed you wanted it to. You turn off the cruise control, the red lights go away, and you would never even know that they're there. That's kind of cool. But the other interesting thing here is the following distance is located inside the speedometer, these little green icons that let you know how far you have selected to follow the car in front of you. This is configurable, of course, but that's adaptive cruise control back in an 08-09 Audi. Now, it won't bring you all the way to a stop, and frankly, I don't trust it to even really be all that reliable, but it's here. Probably not as good as modern systems, but it exists. It was a beginning of something. Now, one other thing worth noting in the gauge cluster, you had your traditional analog gauges like all cars from this era, but in the center between them, you have this little screen. Now, Audis have had this screen for years, but this one, it's full color, it's pretty sharp resolution, and if you press this little mode button on the steering wheel, you can cycle through various different things in here. Your music, your current vehicle status, whatever, you can show various items. So this was kind of forward thinking as far as instrument panel gauge cluster screens went, and you can see this is sort of the beginning of moving to full screen gauge clusters like we have now. It started with little color screens like this one. And next up we move on to the back seat of the C6 S6 as they call it. You can see it's not really all that big back here. Front seat is in a pretty normal spot. My knees are right up against it. It's fine but not huge. I do have good headroom, but it's not a massive back seat. The S6 has gotten larger and larger over the years, but at this time it wasn't that large. You could carry adults back here, but it's not huge in back. Now there are a few interesting things back here. For one thing, you have vents in back for climate control, although you have no climate control adjustments back here, so you're relying on whatever the front seat passengers set the climate control to. You also don't have heated seats back here, although on the subject of seats, you do have S6 printed into the leather in the back. It's unusual to see it in the back. A lot of performance cars have it in the front seats, and this one has it there too, but S6 in the back to even remind the rear passengers of the performance car they are entering. Now, a couple of other noteworthy details back here. For one, you have ashtrays in the rear doors. Both rear doors in back have ashtrays in them. You don't have heated seats or climate controls, but you have two ashtrays back here so rear passengers can smoke. You wouldn't want to deprive them of that luxury. You also have rear sunshades back here on these rear windows. You can lift them up and then shield yourself from the sun, which is of course a nice luxury touch in the back. And next up we move on to the trunk in the S6. You can open it back here and you will see it is incredibly large. It's fairly large just when you open it, but then you look in and it's like cavernous. It goes all the way back in there. Clearly it robs a little bit of rear seat room. I would definitely trade some trunk space for some rear seat room, but you have a huge trunk back here. And when you lift it up, you can see part of the reason for that, you have a full-size spare tire with a full S6 V10 wheel. No temporary tire back here. You also have a big battery in the back too, so big trunk and the accessories you'd want. Surprising to see how large it is back here. It feels like a full-size sedan. And next up on the outside of the S6, moving on to some other interesting quirks. One is on the sunroof. You can see there are solar panels on here. Solar panels integrated into the sunroof on the roof of this car. So what's that about? Well, the solar panels would work with the car's climate control system. And if you parked the car somewhere sunny, and if you had the recirculating air feature on when you had turned the car off, then the solar panels would periodically power the blower fan and the climate control to get fresh air into the interior while you were away. And that way, when you got back to the car, it wasn't quite as stale in there because fresh air had been blowing thanks to those panels. Now that was a cool idea, but the drawback was with the solar panels on the sunroof, you couldn't just have the sunroof cover open and the glass sunroof closed so you could see above you, because there were panels there, there was no glass sunroof. So if you wanted to see above you, you had to actually physically open the sunroof and get the wind to come in. And I guess most people preferred a glass sunroof to those solar panels, and so most cars don't even offer solar panels today, but it was a neat idea. Now, the other thing worth noting on the outside of this car is styling. Incredibly understated, tremendously subtle. By this era, BMWs were already starting to get so obvious in their M-ness. You had big wheels and those grills on the fenders, and they just looked so clearly performance-y. This car was so subtle, you would have no idea of how fast and how special it was unless you really knew. You'd have no clue you were sitting next to a Lamborghini-powered sedan at a stoplight until it took off. It was tremendously subtle, and I love the sleeper effect of this car. One of the most subtle, fast sedans of all time. The only way you could really tell that it had a Lambo V10, aside from maybe the wheels, the exhausts, the V10 badge on the fender. And it was small and it was subtle, but it was there. And it said everything the styling didn't have to. V10. So let's talk about that V10. Open up the hood, you can see it's really jammed in here. Not too often you see a sedan like this with a 10-cylinder engine, but that's exactly what we have. And you can see on the front it says V10 5.2 and then S, the Audi S logo. Although personally, I think that's a missed opportunity. They should have put the Lamborghini logo on this engine. Everybody would have been so excited to see it. You pop the hood, yeah, I got a Lambo V10. But instead they did the Audi stuff for brand positioning. I guess I understand that. Now, It's important to understand this is not precisely the V10 that is in the Lamborghini Gallardo. The Gallardo had a 5-liter V10. This was a 5.2. It was actually a little bit bigger. And the reason for that was the Gallardo's engine was thought to be a little too peaky, a little too high revving for a sedan. So they enlarged the engine a little bit, got a little more low-end torque, which they thought would complement the sedan and the automatic transmission a little bit better. Now, obviously, the S6 also didn't quite have as much power as the Gallardo. The Gallardo was just under 500 horsepower. This was at 435, but that's still a pretty healthy figure for a sedan, especially back in 2007, 2008. Now, it is worth noting that when the Gallardo was updated later in its model run, it adopted the 5.2-liter V10, and when the Audi R8 got a V10 version, it too had the 5.2-liter V10, and then these cars were more meshed again, all basically sharing the engine, although the S6 never had the power of the supercars. It is also worth noting that the Audi S8 from this era also had this engine, the 5.2-liter V10, and the S8 had a little more power. Audi had an edict that the S6 could never have more power than the S8. So the S6 was at 435 horsepower, the S8 was at 450, but it was such a larger car that the S6 was probably just a little bit faster. Audi says 0 to 60 in the low 5-second range for this car. And so those are the quirks and features of the V10 powered Audi S6. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the S6 V10. A couple of interesting things about this car, some pros and some cons driving it, I noticed right away. For one thing, pretty good throttle response and great mid-range power. You're going 40, you stomp on it, and it just, the amount of torque that it has, the amount of power, it feels so much stronger than 435 horsepower and 0 to 60 in 5.1 seconds, or whatever Audi says. It feels, this car may not be the quickest off the line 0 to 60, but in the mid-range is where it really, really feels strong. And I think that addition of extra torque, the slight enlargement of the engine compared to the Lamborghini, less peakiness, getting the torque down low, that was a benefit to this car. It really feels strong at all speeds and RPMs. But also some drawbacks to driving this car. The biggest is unquestionably the transmission. That 0 to 60 in 5.1, you might look at this thing and say 435 horsepower, big V10, it's only doing 0 to 60 in 5.1. I think that was all because of the transmission. It just feels slow. It's slow to shift, it's slow to downshift if you're accelerating fast. Once that downshift happens, you move with the torque like I was just saying, but starting from a start, it's just kind of disappointing. And going through shifts and downshifting, it's kind of disappointing, this transmission. That's the reality of a car from this era, 2007, 2008. You know, they had torque converter automatics and they just weren't as fast as modern transmissions. The other interesting thing that surprises me about this car is steering and handling is not as precise as I was expecting it to be. It's relatively good, but the engine is way out over the front in this car. It's not the best balanced. And so you do have some understeer, and steering is not, you know, as precise as a modern car. It's too bad because I think this was the best S6 on paper. V10, incredibly understated styling. I mean, the Lambo engine, this car has a lot going for it, but I just wish it drove like a modern, not even a modern S6, a modern, really great performance car. I think that would really improve things a bit, because this really was the high watermark of the S6 in so many ways, but you know, it's a 12-year-old car with a 12-year-old driving experience, as you would expect, and so it just isn't quite a modern car when you're steering and handling it. One thing I do love in here is the build quality of this interior is absolutely fantastic. Audi kind of knew in the 2000s that one way they could start to gain ground on BMW and Mercedes was just out-interior them. And so this is actually a pretty modern feeling interior given the age of this car, and everything just feels nice. Like this, there's no creaking or rattling in here, even though this has 135,000 miles on it. It just feels like a pretty nice interior. Everything pretty high quality, everything well put together. Everything still looks great 12 years later. Overall, this is certainly a very interesting car. And every time I see him, I give him a second look and a third look. And I mean, these are rare now. They're really hard to find, especially in nice shape, and this is in pretty good shape. And I really like these, and I always have, and I really think that the Lambo V10 is just an amazingly cool thing. I do wish it had a little bit more precision in the steering and a little bit quicker transmission. You could probably get the steering and handling where you want it to go with some suspension modifications, but I suspect that the transmission, you're just kind of stuck. The good news is that this Audi transmission did not have the problems of the earlier ones with the torque converters. Audi beefed up everything, knowing they had to do better. The transmission transmissions couldn't die like they were. I haven't heard of transmission problems in this car, like it was common in the C5, A6, and RS6, and even the B5, S4s, and A4s. Overall, this is a really good car, especially for the money. It's just cool. You got a Lambo V10. It's just cool. It doesn't have quite the performance that I think you would associate with a Lambo V10, but it's still like a neat car. It's fun to drive, and I love how it looks, and I love the interior. And there's a lot of great things in here. And frankly, these cars are kind of bargains now, given what they offer and given how special they are. And I truly do think it was the high point of the Audi S6. And so that's the Audi S6 with the Lamborghini V10. These were beasts, the absolute peak of the Audi S6 lineage, the one time you could actually get a supercar engine in your sedan. It's amazing they even made it. I have always wanted to check this car out. They're hard to find, but if you want to buy this one, you can do it on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the S6 V10 a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the S6 is a handsome car, but a relatively dull one, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration 0 to 60 is around 5 seconds, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Handling is fine, but not as sharp as BMW rivals, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Fun factor is fine, acceleration isn't as lightning fast as modern performance sedans, and the driving experience is a bit dulled by somewhat neutral steering and a slow-ish transmission, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Cool factor, however, is better, a luxury sports sedan with a Lambo V10, how insane, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 28 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The S6 is reasonably well equipped for its day, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Comfort is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Quality is good. The interior is fantastic, and while reliability is always a concern with these older Audis, I generally hear surprisingly good things about these, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, value, and these are surprisingly cheap for what they offer. The reliability could be a concern, but even still, it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 28 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 56 out of 100, which places the S6 here against some other relevant cars. Frankly, this is exactly where I'd expect it, behind the iconic E39 M5 and the more engaging C5 RS6, but ahead of the flawed E60 M5, and ahead of less practical cars like the E46 M3 and Maserati Coupe. This S6 was a special car, and we'll always remember the time a Lamborghini engine went into an Audi sedan.